Hello, my name is David Bruce. I've had a few requests in the comments to talk about my own music, so I thought I'd take this chance to tell you the story of one of my first and still most successful pieces, and that's a piece that's named after these. I didn't call it wellies. In some parts of the world, and specifically in this case in South Africa, these are called Gumboots, and that's the title of the piece I wrote in 2008 for clarinet and string quartet. So Gumboots was my first full commission from a large institution. It was the first piece where, sometime after the initial performance, I was actually contacted out of the blue by someone who I didn't know, who wanted to perform the piece again. And it's been my most performed piece over the 10 years it's been out there. And I'll talk to you a bit about the numbers involved there, because I think that gives an interesting insight into how things work in the classical world and what success means there. Now, of course, numbers aren't really an indicator of success, and I'm not sure I would say Gumboots is my best piece. I've always been conscious of something that the wonderful Philip Pullman said about library books. He said that you can't tell from the data what effect a book has had on the reader. So there might be a book on the shelf that's only been taken out 3 times in the last year. But what if each of those 3 times it changed the reader's life? So, I'm fully aware that numbers by themselves shouldn't be the most important thing. But this is still a piece I'm very happy with, and you could say the most has happened to it over the years, so in a way it has the most interesting story to tell. So the piece was commissioned by Carnegie Hall, and this came about thanks to a previous opportunity which I'd had to write a piece for them, which I talked about in my How to Get to Carnegie Hall video. That piece, called Piosenki, had gone down really well, and a few months later the artistic director of Carnegie Hall had emailed me and asked me if I'd like to write a new piece. So although the previous piece was technically commissioned, this one felt much more real. It was to be for Todd Palmer and the St. Lawrence String Quartet, so some of America's top chamber musicians, and it would have the premiere in their Zankel Hall the following year. I remember the panic when they asked me what fee I would like for the commission. At that point I would have quite happily paid them for the commission, and I remember I had to ask around to find out roughly what kind of figure I should suggest. It was really hard to write that email suggesting, basically a professional level commission fee for my piece. But they came back with a figure pretty close to what I suggested, so I felt like I got it approximately in the right ballpark. So I'll talk about the piece itself in a minute, but as I said, this was the first piece of mine to develop a life of its own out there in the real world. It was probably a year or more after the initial premiere that I had an email from a group in Australia asking how they could get hold of the parts. I'll never forget that feeling of shock and amazement that someone had discovered my work and were actively seeking it out to put on another performance simply from their own free will. I think Carnegie Hall had posted a recording on their website and they'd heard about it that way. And gradually over the years, more and more groups have performed the piece in every corner of the world, and it's had well over 100 performances now. There are quite a few performances of the piece on YouTube, and one professional recording by some amazing players from the UK, Julian, Bliss and the Carducci Quartet. I'm sure that for some people outside of the classical world, 100 performances seems like a pitifully low amount. But in my experience, that's an enormous amount for a new piece to have. It's actually pretty hard to get proper statistics on this kind of thing, but it's definitely a pretty small minority of new pieces that receive anything like that number. In fact, most of us classical composers are over the moon to even get a second performance of a piece. I don't know how comprehensive they are, but if you browse many of the publishers' websites, they have listings of forthcoming performances. And what's striking is how few composers have more than just a handful of performances listed each year. And that's a handful of performances from their entire catalogue. So there are a few big names like John Adams or Thomas Addis who have several hundred performances over the year. But even names that in the UK are considered among our leading composers, like say Mark Anthony Turnage or Harrison Birtwistle, will often show just 10 or 15 performances. Several of those are usually a world premiere. So to that extent, and this is a pretty random guess, but I wouldn't be surprised if Gumboots is in the top 100 of new chamber pieces in terms of the number of performances it's had in its first 10 years. But I'm honestly not trying to brag here. It's more that I'm fascinated by these statistics in the classical world, which you don't often hear about, and it's really amazing to think that some of the apparently leading composers get so few performances. So this has often led me to the question with this piece of whether there are any other factors other than the music itself which have helped the piece on its way. The actual combination seems to be quite helpful, clarinet plus string quartet. There are an absolutely amazing number of string quartets out there, way more than any other ensemble, and clarinets are high among the choice of instruments they tend to work with, adding into the mix of concerts from time to time. But the combination is also good for new music groups who like to have a flexible variety of smaller instrumental combinations, and most will have a string quartet and a clarinet amongst their ranks, so it's an easy combination for them to go for as well. The title itself, I think, helps. It certainly sticks in your mind. I remember prevaricating for weeks about whether I should call such a serious commission from such an august institution such a silly name. But now I think it was one of the best decisions I ever made. It really lodges in people's minds as an icon of the piece, the way Clarinet Quintet just wouldn't. And particularly because it's quite a positive, uplifting piece, so the title has a strong and accurate hint of the flavour of the piece itself. Finally, the sort of programme note, the idea behind the title, also helped in a number of performances, because it has several aspects that make it fit well into programming in a number of ways. People have all sorts of reasons for choosing the pieces that they put on in their concerts, but it's quite common for people to find a theme that connects all the pieces, so it might be love and longing, or the influence of folk music. So Gumboots relates to the South African tradition of Gumboot dancing. During the apartheid era, black miners were made to work in mines which were sometimes flooded, and rather than draining the mine, which was expensive, the miners were made to wear boots and chains. They were forbidden from communicating, so they created a sort of secret language through tapping and stomping, and this eventually turned into a dance, the Gumboot dance, which today is a big tourist attraction in South Africa. My piece relates to that tradition, not in any direct way, it's not a pictorial description of any particular scenes, and it doesn't contain any specifically Gumboot dance-related music, although there are lots of hints of other African music in the piece. Instead, the piece is what I think of as a celebration of the rejuvenating power of dance. This amazing story that from such a dark place this incredible life-affirming dance was born. It's a real testament to human willpower. And the overall shape of my piece marks a journey from an introspective first half through to a really joyous foot-tapping conclusion. So as a result, the piece gets programmed on concerts that relate to dance and on concerts that relate to the resilience of the human spirit. I should stress that this isn't something I was thinking about cynically in advance. This is something I've just noticed over the years. So let's talk about the music itself now. I mentioned in the Carnegie Hall video how I'd had a shock success with my piece Piosenki by casting aside attempts to write a serious piece of music and just having some fun with a folk music inspired piece. So Gumboots was the first piece after that where I was trying to come to terms with that success and work out which direction my music was going to go in as a result. I felt I had an instinct for picking out aspects of that exciting, earthy, raw sound you get in folk music and translating that into something that classical musicians can recreate. So my interest in folk music is usually less to do with specific melodies or harmonies, and more to do with colours, ways of playing, ways of interacting, and of course rhythms. So the first things in this piece I wrote were some dances. Allowing myself to write short, single-idea movements, dances, songs, whatever, was another way of escaping from that idea of a serious piece that had, developmental characteristics. Each dance just really does one thing and then stops. It's certainly a successful way of avoiding the overly earnest lack of focus you often get in a new piece that attempts to expand into 10 or 20 minutes of continuous music. I like the crispness of form you get from keeping it short. So as an example, the second dance I think was inspired by some call and response style African singing. The clarinet becomes the leader and the strings intermittently interject or respond. The final dance has the most direct influence, which came out of this amazing rhythm from the Baka people of Cameroon. I talked about this a while back in my video on rhythmic illusions. It has a kind of polyrhythm which I found fascinating because it's so hard to pin down. And it was a great starting point for this whole dance to have two ways of attacking a 9/8 bar, one with this kind of pattern da 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 dam da 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 dam, and another that is just a straight 3 in a bar, but in the backer example starts in an entirely unexpected part of the bar. So in my dance I moved the steady beat to different parts of the bar, so it would come in sometimes on the beat and sometimes off the beat. And this gave me something to play around with and to create a new piece from. So having written a bunch of these dances and starting forming them into a shape, I had a strong sensation that something was lacking, and one day I suddenly realised that the piece needed a long, slow first part, so one movement of say 10 minutes or so, and that would be an exact counterbalance to the collection of short dances that would form the second part overall. I have to say I've never had such a clear structural realisation before, but it just felt right. It felt interesting because it was quite a unique structure. I don't know of any other pieces that have 10 minutes of slow followed by 5 increasingly lively short dances. But once I had that idea, this kind of bluesy lyrical first movement came to me quite quickly, and in particular the haunting sound of the lyrically played bass clarinet became its focus. And you can hear another example of the folk influence. This opening imitates the way two folk musicians might play the same melody slightly different, slightly apart. Here those differences are precisely notated. In the rest of the first part, the bass clarinet melody is accompanied by kind of shimmering harmonic tremolos in the strings. Some of these are produced by playing the open string and then touching a harmonic on and off, which produces this kind of glass-like effect, which I really like. I should also mention one aspect about the bass clarinet, which is this note. As you can guess, that's pretty high up for a bass clarinet to be playing. The equivalent note on the normal B-flat clarinet would look like this. Us composers like to push the boundaries of the playable on instruments in search of new sounds, and my hope was that the strain of this high note would add to the yearning quality I was going for. But I wasn't certain it was playable at all. I emailed Todd to ask him, and he wrote back instantly to say, "No way." And then half an hour later I had a phone call, and it was him, and he said, "You know what? Actually, it's okay." So probably quite a few clarinetists won't thank Todd for that answer, because the note certainly is right on the border of playability, and it often gets cracked during performance. I added an alternative ossia part for anyone who's not feeling brave enough to reach it. But most do give it their best shot, and those times it does come off successfully, well, it's a really special moment. If you have any specific questions about the piece, do let me know in the comments. I'll link to the Bliss recording below, which you can get on streaming services, and to a couple of other excellent performances here on YouTube and elsewhere. And I finally managed to knock my Spotify artists profile page into a bit more shape, so if you want to go there you should see most of my recorded music available. Thanks so much for watching, thank you so much to my patrons on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.